Okay, we have folks who are being added, and so we'll start the webinar in a few minutes once everybody's kind of filed in here. Okay, it looks like people are still joining us. So we'll wait a little bit longer. Okay. Oh, we've still got people filing in. All right. Give it another few seconds here. Okay. All right. As folks are kind of trickling in, I think we've got most folks who are in. Welcome everybody to another lunch hour webinar. We are so grateful for our speaker, Leigh Markowitz, today. And we are also very grateful for the co-sponsored event between the animal law section and the environmental and land use section. Thank you again, everyone who's joining us. It looks like we've got most folks in, hopefully. So we'll go ahead and get started here. Leigh Markowitz, our speaker today, is a fellow in the Nova Southeastern University Disability Inclusion and Advocacy Law Clinic in Fort Lauderdale. She attended undergrad at the University of Florida and graduated from Duke University School of Law. During her time in law school, she interned for Mercy for Animals, the Humane Society of the United States, and the Southern Environmental Law Center. She also spent 3 semesters in the Environmental Law and Policy Clinic, and Leigh has also taught animal law as an adjunct professor at Nova University. Today, she'll be talking to us about factory farming and its environmental impacts, and we are very excited to hear everything that she has to say. I will share the course number at the very end of the presentation. And I will also, we should have a few minutes where we can answer a few of your questions. So if you do have any questions that pop up during the presentation, go ahead and type them in using the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. And if you just type them as you go, I'll open them up at the end and we'll ask Leigh at pop quiz for our professor. And without further ado, I will hand this presentation off to Leigh. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. You should be thanking you. I'm very excited. As you heard from my bio, my full-time job is in the disability law world, but this is my greatest passion, and I'm really excited to get to talk to you all about it today. So as you can tell from the title of the presentation, it's pretty broad. We're going to be covering quite a bit, and so I'm not going to go too deep on a lot of it. I mean, we're talking about environmental harms and the conflict between state right to farm and nuisance laws, because I think this stuff is also very intrinsically connected. So like I said, we'll probably won't go super deep on everything because I do want to cover a lot with you all. Okay, so I want to start with a bit of terminology. While there are a lot of ethical implications that could be discussed, a lot of these terms, my point of offering them right now is more for context rather than the focus of the presentation. So, but I do want to spend a little bit of time with these terms because I think it is important to set the stage. So we're going to be hearing CAFO a lot, but to start, just an AFO is an animal feeding operation. And a CAFO is a concentrated animal feeding operation. We're going to go way more in depth on that term going forward. So for now, I'll move forward. Gestation crates, for those of you who haven't heard, are these individual metal stalls that are just about big enough for a pregnant pig to stand up and lie down, but not turn around. Such confinement tools contributes to a farm's ability to squeeze in a lot of animals together in a single facility, which contributes to the vast amount of waste that gets produced. That's just something that we'll build on as we move into why these wastes and whatnot have such a negative environmental implication. And so other than the ethical implications, this type of confinement means more waste concentrated in one place with few options for disposal. Something kind of which is actually pretty cool is that Florida has outlawed these particular types of confinement crates. So yay, Florida. If you're interested in checking that out, it's Article 10, Section 21 of the Florida Constitution that outlaws use of gestation crates. Unfortunately, there still is other issues that we have to deal with, other states that still use these tools. So we're going to kind of jump back and forth today with talking about Florida specific law, federal level, some bits and pieces from other states, just kind of a general overview. So then these types of restrictions that we see in the Florida Constitution, if you check that out, on cruel practices are most often found at the state level because there's very little protection at the national level for animals being produced for food. That's actually one of the reasons that environmental protection laws are such a powerful tool for tackling the cruel treatment of animals, because they're one of our few tools we have at the federal level. So back to our terms, battery cages are where egg-laying hens are restricted to about the space of a sheet of paper. While cage-free, another one of our terms, are not confined to those kinds of cages. That does not mean that they get to be outdoors or that they have much more additional space. So some of those terms are just important to understand their real meaning or lack thereof. Again, there are extensive ethical issues that we could, discuss pertaining to the treatment of these animals, but my objective in addressing these terms is to focus on how they contribute to confinement and large numbers of animals being held together. Other animals like dairy cows are housed in tie stalls. They experience a similar level of confinement. As we go into the definition of CAFOs in a couple of slides, you will see that the ability to produce a lot in a certain amount of space that is available is a central theme here. And then the last term that I wanted to go over is the lagoon and spray field systems. These are one of the common used waste management systems where animal waste is stored in a large lagoon. They're actually called that. I don't think I included any aerial photos, but if you can find them, they look like these big pink lagoons, like a big pink pond, and that's from stuff that's the interactions between the waste and what's used to treat it, or what other chemicals are inputted there. And so the lagoon and spray field system is one in which waste goes into lagoons, and then they actually spray it as, in theory, a fertilizer over fields, and that can spread pretty far. And so it's waste being taken out of this lagoon and sprayed everywhere. So keeping all of these concepts in mind, we're going to move on to the AFOs. So just generally, animal feeding operation is a lot or a facility other than an aquatic animal production facility. So those are categorized differently under the Florida Administrative Code. And under these AFOs, animals have been or will be stabled or confined and fed or maintained for a total of 45 days or more in any 12-month period. And the crop's vegetation, forage growth, or post-harvest residues are not sustained in the normal growing season over any portion of the lot or facility. So kind of these artificial structures that are used for production. Pretty general. As we get into now CAFOs, it's really specific on what is considered a concentrated animal feeding operation. So it's all about, as I mentioned before, the number of animals confined. So our Florida code tells us that for cows, that's 100. And you'll notice there's a difference between slaughter and feeder cattle versus dairy cows, because the farms have very different purposes. The cows that are kept for milk versus the farms with cows used for slaughter. So we're going to take a little bit of a deviation for a moment from the definition to talk about this interesting exception when it comes to concentrated animal feeding operations housing mature dairy cattle. So dairy farms located in the Lake Okeechobee drainage basin, as defined in the administrative code, are regulated differently. Let's take our little interlude into that. The Florida code tells us that dairy farms located in this region, which I'll show a map on the next slide, the discharge of untreated wastewater and runoff from dairy farms may reasonably be expected to be a source of pollution to the waters of the state. So in this area, we're supposed to just assume that the discharge of untreated wastewater and runoff is just a regular source of pollution. We need to just assume that. The discharge of dairy farm wastewater and runoff to the waters of the state shall not cause or contribute to a violation of water quality standards. So that means that the wastewater from dairy farms in that Lake Okeechobee drainage basin that ends up in the waters of Florida are not considered to violate water quality standards. It's an important exception. So these are just a couple maps from the South Florida Water Management District, which has jurisdiction over a lot of these issues. And just to kind of take a look, the first shows the dairy farm locations, and then the second, it just gives a little bit more information as far as what the categories are of the different drainage basins. So once again, the code tells us, gives us more information. So we have the lower Kissimmee River Basin is all as part of this region. We have, there's a Fish Eating Creek, so this section. So really, there's a lot of area that is any wastewater that is produced there is not going to go towards what could be a violation of water quality standards. So even if it maybe otherwise would, because it's in this region, we are told to assume that that's just the way it is. So I just think that that's a very useful piece of information, thinking about Florida specifically and thinking about where these rules are made and kind of why things are the way they are, which we're going to get into a little bit more when we get into the right to farm stuff at the end. So moving back to our CAFO definition. So continue on with, it's all measured by how many animals, and each type of farm is different. So a farm with 2,500 pigs, 500 horses, 10,000 sheep, 55,000 turkeys. Then we have two different kinds of hens. We have based on the type of waste management. So we have 100,000 laying hens or broilers are considered a CAFO if the facility has a continuous overflow watering system. So that's one that flows constantly, as opposed to one that only provides water when a chicken triggers a mechanism, or one that provides stagnant water that is cleaned and refilled on a periodic basis. Whereas you can have 30,000, only 30,000 becomes a CAFO if the facility has a liquid manure handling system, which can have fewer make it a CAFO versus in the system where things are constantly flowing, more of them before it has to be labeled as a CAFO. And being labeled as a CAFO is important for later permitting requirements. So moving on to another map. So if you want to look and get any more details, these are the permitted animal feeding operations in Florida. You can find more information if you're interested in an interactive map on the Department of Environmental Protection, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection's website. So I love these kinds of interactive maps. One of the things that I found really cool when I was working in North Carolina was they developed this thing called the EJ tool, and it's an interactive map to try to assess where different environmental justice issues are occurring. And we'll talk a little bit about environmental justice later on in the presentation. So yes, so if you see, we'll get a zoom in on parts of the map, but each of these dots are clusters of areas that have been permitted to house AFOs or CAFOs. You'll notice, and there's a little key later on, but here we have a little dark blue square. That means it's just an AFO site. Notice there's only about 2 of those. Everything that's surrounded by a little light blue square means that there's a CAFO actual facility there. You'll notice there's quite a few around this area here. So let's maybe zoom. So this particular map though is up to date as of May 8th of 2020. So things may have changed, but this is what has been updated by the Department of Environmental Protection. So anyone, and I mentioned this in the last slide, the permitting is why it's important to have something labeled as a CAFO, is because once it fits that definition, any person discharging or proposing to discharge pollutants from a CAFO has to file an application for a permit with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. Okay, so here I just did a little bit of a zoom in on this map. And again, if you want to look around yourself, I think it's a pretty cool tool. It's on that Florida Department of Environmental Protection website. And if you have trouble finding it at the end, you can reach out and I can assist you. But yeah, you'll notice here that's more clusters. So each of the dots actually, let me go on to the next slide because that's even more. But yeah, so each of these dots have sites that are permitted, and then an actual facility has been built in each of these. You see good number around Florida's waters. Okay, moving on. What are some of the environmental impacts that occur around these? And the reason we're talking mostly about CAFOs is that when you're speaking about maybe a small family farm, there's not going to be that level of waste that is going to cause the detriments that these vast production facilities do. So that's kind of why we're keeping our discussion here as to the environmental impacts in that context of these large concentrated animal feeding operations. So we're going to be dealing with water pollution. It's on the maps. A lot of these facilities are right near some of Florida's major waters. Air pollution, and we'll talk a little bit at the end about a big air pollution issue as it pertains to public health as well. And if we have time, we can talk a little bit about a specific instance in North Carolina where that really was extremely detrimental to the community. Wildlife endangerment, I mean, beyond the fish that are in the waters, the animals that also are inhaling the pollutants and whatnot. We won't go into that as deeply, but those are where you're going to see the impacts. And then we'll talk about environmental justice and how that is also just so deeply connected. All right, and just a quick fun fact, and this is once again why we're talking about these concentrated animal feeding operations and not just, your 1 or 2 cows at a small family farm in northern Florida, is that a single large CAFO can produce as much raw sewage as the entire city of Philadelphia. And that's just one trivia fact that, we could have a whole presentation talking about those, but just for a little perspective to understand why this is such a a major issue. Okay, moving on to talking a little bit about the pollution caused by these CAFOs, Florida's air and waters. So as we mentioned in the first slide, we went over some of the terms. The lagoon and spray field methods are putting pollutants directly into the air. That's can't get any more straightforward from that. And once again, we'll talk a little bit more about the public health implications of that, but that particular system is pretty detrimental. Specifically talking about Florida's waters, the runoff from these facilities can cause algae blooms and fish kills. And I think on the next slide, I have a kind of a map that we can get a little more context for those algae blooms that can be a direct hit because of these CAFOs. For those of you who haven't heard of the Water Keepers, it's a nonprofit organization that are across, I think, most states, but I really just have experience with the North Carolina and Florida ones. And they protect each different body of water, and they're actually set, like their job is to protect each specific region. And they have a lot of great information. And I'm going to kind of keep just dropping these things throughout to where you can find more information, because this topic is so broad and so prevalent, especially here in Florida with all of our valuable water resources. But so check out the Water Keepers if you haven't. Some of them have more developed websites than the others because they're newer. They're kind of hub in North Carolina, which is where I first learned about the work that they do. A lot of lawsuits that are happening in North Carolina have them as plaintiffs to try to protect the waters. And if we have time at the end, I have a little video that features some of them. And it's just a very cool organization. And let's see, where was I? Okay, yes. Yes, as far as the animals, we talked about wildlife in the last slide, and just how the pollutants and the effect it has on the fish kills, and then going to have an effect on the food cycle. So just everything just kind of keeps going. The pollution from these types of facilities spreads both through surface water as well as groundwaters. There's lagoons where waste is buried. It's going to be seeping right out if there's cracks, and can easily get pretty far into Florida's waters. And think about the flooding that we experience in Florida during our heavy rain seasons, and that causes the waste to go everywhere. A lot of videos went viral after major hurricanes in North Carolina, where you saw the big swine CAFOs, and you saw the pigs floating. And I mean, they were heartbreaking videos. We also saw that they were floating in their own waste all across because of the flooding, and that carries that waste. So thinking about how far reaching these impacts can be. So once again, being defined as a CAFO is very important because they are considered point source pollutants under the Clean Water Act, which means they require an NPDES permit, which is the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. And that is just, these permits regulate how much these facilities can pollute into these bodies of water. Unfortunately, most regulations are about how much you can pollute, not whether or not you can pollute. And that's, unfortunately, that's just a reality, is eliminating pollution completely. And that'd be nice. And so these permits are important, and this is kind of brings it back to an earlier point, just as far as how we don't have a lot of tools to fight some of these issues as far as the treatment of farm animals. But on the federal level, the environmental tools are pretty big, and things like the Clean Water Act are the way to target some of these facilities. And while it may be because of the pollution that these federal laws are involved, it still can come back to, okay, well, it's because we have all of these animals confined together and all of this waste. And if we maybe improve treatment, it would animals, more space, better conditions, cleaner, it would be better for the water. So these federal level environmental protection statutes are one of our greatest tools if you're interested in the actual protection of the farm animals and their treatment in facilities. All right, I think it's time for another map. So okay. So take a look at this map for a second. The blue dots are places where their samples have been taken in the last 30 days for algae, to look for algae blooms. And what it is about 43% of those in the last 30 days came up with had a positive for algae bloom. So these are all the places that have been tested. Blue dots where they've been tested in the last 30 days. And then so a little, almost half have been, and these have been positive for algae blooms. And if you notice, a lot of this test sites are coming back to Lake Okeechobee here, because that's a pretty big region. All right. Okay, so now we're kind of going a little bit back to that air pollution issue, and what you'll find emitting from these CAFOs are ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, methane, particulate matter. These have issues for respiratory system. There's a lot of asthma in some of these regions. It's particularly where I have the most experience again is in North Carolina. That's where I did most of my personal work on this. And the prevalence of asthma around these regions is shocking. So once again, we're gonna have sea issues in the air and the waters. When you are confining so many animals together in order to increase production, there's just not enough space to clean the waste, to dispose of it properly. And that's, a big reason that they do the spray field methods, is because they think, okay, there just isn't enough space, let's dispose of it. But there's so much of it that even maybe some parts could have been natural fertilizer if you weren't thinking about what all is actually in that waste. What are we feeding our livestock and whatnot? Then maybe you don't want that as natural fertilizer. But even if that was a good method, there's so much that there is no way to contain it when we are at this level of production. Okay. So yeah, there's so much, and I have a slide at the end with a couple links to some of these reports and resources, because there is so much out there, and I couldn't condense it all. So now let's talk about environmental justice and why that is such an issue when it comes to factory farming. It's all about the placement of the facilities, and we have a lot of issues in different contexts where this arises in different states, different regions, but and we'll start with just the EPA definition, which is that environmental justice means the just treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of income, race, color, national origin, tribal affiliation, or disability, in agency decision-making and other federal activities that affect human health and the environment, so that people are fully protected from disproportionate and adverse human health and environmental effects, including risks and hazards, including those related to climate change, the cumulative impacts of environmental and other burdens, and the legacy of racism or other structural or systemic barriers, and have equitable access to a healthy, sustainable, and resilient environment in which to live, play, work, learn, grow, worship, and engage in cultural and subsistence practices. So this is the definition of environmental justice that the EPA gives us. I'm sure you'll find different variations of it from different nonprofits, different state agencies, but this is usually what you'll get. And I would ask, this isn't like a call and response thing, but I would say, if anyone has heard of not in my backyard, and this idea that people don't want these types of facilities where they live, don't want these effects that we've just been talking about to be right there polluting your home. What you will find is that the communities with the most political capital don't have these facilities built in their backyards. The truth is that these facilities are going to be placed in communities, typically minority communities, communities where the legislature is maybe more pro big ag. That's the case, unfortunately, in the communities in Eastern North Carolina. And it's just something that we all need to have more attention drawn to. A big issue, and there's a lot of groups working on it in Florida, actually, is when it comes to the sugar farming. And that is where a lot of those environmental justice issues are occurring here, and that's in these big facilities are built in communities that have the least power to fight them. In North Carolina, in Eastern and Duplin County, and like I keep saying, if we have time, a little video I'd love to show at the end that talks about that county and the prevalence of asthma, children being born with asthma already because of the fumes from the waste facilities in the hog farms out there that are being ingested from before they're born. And that's just one particularly tragic example. And it's these lands, especially, just once again, talking about the areas that I have the most experience in, these lands in Eastern North Carolina have been passed down from families to families, and then these big production, these big CAFOs are placed close enough that the spray field the waste is going, it's in their backyards. It literally is in their backyards. And as we've talked a little bit about some of the public health issues, the environmental issues, there is so much negative implications, hence the part of the title of this presentation, about what these facilities are doing to the surrounding communities and to our larger environment. Okay, so nuisance suits are typically a really good tool for these communities that are neighboring these facilities. And there was a really big case where a lot of the neighbors in that North Carolina community, county that I was talking about, did bring suit, and they're being so their communities being destroyed, and that these facilities are a nuisance. And unfortunately, and as the Supreme Court of Florida has said, which I thought this was a really good description, the law of nuisance lies between two antithetical extremes. You have the principle that every person is entitled to use his property for any purpose that he sees fit, and the opposing principle that everyone is bound to use his property in such a manner as not to injure the property or rights of his neighbor. For generations, courts in their tasks of judging have ruled in these extremes according to the wisdom of the day, and many have recognized that the contemporary view of public policy shifts from generation to generation. So we're dealing with changing sensibilities, changing priorities, politics, and that combating principle of people being able to use their property to live and not be harmed and how to have their environment harmed, not everyone to be able to stand up for the environment we're living in, versus the property rights to be able to use it to produce, in the case of these CAFOs, to produce animals for food and other products. Regardless of what people think about using animals for food, this principle takes us, I think, out from that simple decision. You know, that's something, once again, something I'd be happy to talk to anyone about at length, but regardless of how you feel about that on any principle level, we're talking now about the right to live in an environment free from environmental pollutants versus this other right to property and to do business. And yeah, I think that this does a really good job of summarizing that conflict. And to bring that more into focus, a lot of most states, probably, I have not done a survey, but I would be shocked. I guess it would depend on the type of environment in each state, but most states do have what are called right to farm laws, and they do work directly to undermine nuisance suits. So the Florida Right to Farm Act states that, and this is our Florida law. The legislature finds that agricultural production is a major contributor to the economy of the state. The agricultural lands constitute unique and irreplaceable resources of statewide importance, that the continuation of agricultural activities preserves the landscape and environmental resources of the state, contributes to the increase of tourism, including agritourism, and furthers the economic self-sufficiency of the people of the state, and that the encouragement, development, improvement, and preservation of agriculture will result in a general benefit to the health and welfare of the people of the state. The legislature further finds that agricultural activities conducted on farmland in urbanizing areas are potentially subject to lawsuits based on the theory of nuisance, and that these suits encourage and even force the premature removal of the farmland from agricultural use. It is the purpose of this act to protect reasonable agricultural and complementary agritourism activities conducted on farmland from nuisance suits and other similar lawsuits. You notice that fun term, reasonable. As someone who gets to work with law students every day, I love throwing that at them, and I'm sure everyone remembers how that term was probably the bane of your existence in law school. But what is the protection of reasonable agricultural activities? And unfortunately, it's not never a straight answer. Okay. So continuing to look at this, Florida's right to farm law, we have a little bit more explanation as far as what conditions do constitute evidence of a nuisance. But I really want to bring you to Part D, which is a nuisance action may not be filed against a farm operation unless the real property affected by the conditions alleged to be a nuisance is located within half a mile of the source of the activity or structure alleged to be a nuisance. Just for context, odors can travel much further than a half a mile under the right conditions. Think about water movements. Think about how far things spread. These statutes, when we're thinking about right to farm laws over, across the United States, are very powerful forces. And then just another definition that is provided in the Florida Right to Farm Act is what a farm operation is, and that is all conditions or activities by the owner, lessee, agent, independent contractor, or supplier, which occur on a farm in connection with the production of farm honeybee or apiculture products, or in connection with complementary agritourism activities. These conditions and activities include, but are not limited to, the marketing of farm products at roadside stands or farm markets, the operation of machinery, irrigation pumps, the generation of noise, odors, dust, fumes, and particle emissions. So that one we've talked about quite a bit. Ground or aerial seeding and spraying, the placement and operation of an apiary, the application of chemical fertilizers, conditions, insecticides, pesticides, and herbicides, agritourism activities, and the employment and use of labor. So farm operation is a pretty far-reaching term as far as what is, what is considered. Okay, I think we do. I'm going to play just a few minutes, if that's okay, of this video. So it looks like we're right on schedule, unless Laura, are there questions about anything we've discussed so far that would be better placed now or after the video?
The one question I have so far is, can you restate how many cows are required for something to be labeled as a CAFO? Was it 50 or was that for the AFO?
So AFOs don't have a number requirement, and that's one of the big, and I'm just going to take us back to that slide in case you want to.
I almost interrupted to ask, but then you were on a roll and I was like, I'll wait till she gets to the end.
No, it's a good clarifying question because it brings us back to why the term AFO really doesn't mean very much, because it doesn't have these specific numbers that we get when it comes to CAFOs, which is then what requires the particular permitting. So it's when we're talking about, I think the question was about cows. When we're talking about cows, we're talking about 1,000 if it's for slaughter facilities versus 700 when we're talking about dairy facilities.
Okay, perfect. And then the next question that just came in now is, how does Florida CAFO definitions compare to other states? Do you know?
I haven't done a full survey, and that would be really interesting to look at. I wonder if, because like the example I gave with North Carolina, and I don't have it off the top of my head now, I'm kind of speculating, but I would be interested to know, and I'll look into this, whether it's based on what type of animal production that state is most reliant on. So if you notice, I think we were talking about pigs, it takes 2,500 pigs to be a CAFO. And I would wonder, and I can look this up, but I'm going to actually right away after this, because I'm very curious if in North Carolina that number differs because pigs are one of their biggest agricultural commodities. So it's a really great question. And from what I've seen, a lot of stuff is usually pretty similar amongst the states. It just depends on how big of an emphasis agriculture is in that particular state and what type of agriculture is the most prevalent.
But most importantly, I mean, this is set by state law, so it will likely vary state to state. And I guess the question then becomes like, where does Florida lie in here? Are we an outlier? Are we not? And it's a great question. So I hope that we've given you some food for thought on it, at least, Mr. Charles. Thank you for asking. And then that concludes our open questions if you want to go to the video.
Excellent. We'll just play the beginning of it. It's available if anyone wants to watch the rest, but this kind of gives you that visual as far as this is the North Carolina region I was talking about. It has the reason that I have a lot of data on it is because, like I said, that's where I had my experience. And it's also, there's a lot of really strong community groups there that have brought a lot of this to light. So let's just play a few minutes of it.
This industry has taken something from me that's very valuable. When I was a kid, I just wanted to be on the water. And I was going to float on the oldest, dirtiest, grubby floats I had and get out on that river. Fish were healthy. The was clean. There were camps along the river, boats everywhere along this river. And it was nice, you know, we had a garden, we played. We didn't stay outside long. I went barefooted, walk on the ground with no shoes on.
It was just a complacent time, a friendly time, you know, it was a neighborly time.
People living in rural America live there because they enjoy the outdoors. And people enjoy the quiet life and the openness and the ability to be able to get out, walk up and down the roadways.
When you got all these lakes and the creek and the swamp, and you can come down here, it's awful wonderful.
When things began to change, the fish started dying. The crabs started even having holes in their shells. My son's body was filled with sores. Mine was covered with sores.
I got that threat. I had no idea that the research that I was doing would be so unpalatable to the industry.
My name is Violet Branch. My mom and dad bought this farm when I was 3 months old in 1943, and I've been here ever since. One day the hogs came in and they came in on school buses. There were 3 levels, the floor, the middle, and then the top of baby pigs. And then they would come in on 18-wheelers.
They started building the hog houses at probably in the 80s. And then later on, probably the early 90s, they started putting them on there so you can see them.
Most people do not recognize that for what it is. It's a hog farm.
So where is I don't like calling them lagoons.
We call them cesspools.
So where is the cesspool
It's over to the left of the building, but on the other side of that tree line.
behind the trees?
Right.
We had an inkling that there was something amiss with our property, but we could never really put our finger on it. We would always try to put together what was going on, but we never could.
What was going on in the river where we lost 1 billion fish in just a couple of days with open bleeding lesions all over the body and millions and hundreds of millions more since then? That had a cause that was beyond the shores of the river. So I got in an airplane and I flew all the way to Raleigh. Then I flew up the Trent River into Jones County. And I'm looking down there and there's these huge pink, what are now cesspools. I didn't know what they were. And then there's buildings that were there, but you couldn't see anything. It was just metal buildings. They didn't even look like barns. And then these huge open pits with all this stuff in it. So when I landed, I called a friend of mine in the Department of Environmental Management in Little Washington, North Carolina. And I said, I just came out here. What is all this stuff out there? And he said, Rick, you don't know? I said, no. He said, that's all feces and urine. And I said, well, I saw some of it being sprayed on the ground. What's that? He said, that's how they get rid of it. And then, as I remember his words, he says, Rick, it's basically dumping.
In eastern North Carolina, east of 95, we have 10 million hogs. So we've got the same number of hogs east of I-95 as we have people across all of North Carolina. Hogs produce a lot more waste than people. None of that waste is treated. It's run into an unlined hole in the ground. It's then fired through industrial size sprinklers onto the landscape. And then it rains, and all of that waste, 10 million hogs producing way more waste than 10 million people, runs off into the rivers of eastern North Carolina. And most people have no idea it's happening because these huge facilities are in rural areas and people don't believe that that kind of waste management could happen.
I've seen them spraying into the river directly. I've seen them spraying in the ditches that went to the river. I've seen them put pipes in the ground with a depression so they could spray in the depression. The pipe would pick it up and take it to the river. I've seen it again. It's going on for a long time.
The idea was that the soil is supposed to absorb all the wastes. And it's absolutely impossible because of where the industry sited. It's sited in areas down east, which were formerly wetlands, where the water table is only 3 feet from the surface. 3 feet.
They're spraying back there.
Oh my God, they are.
Get the smell?
Yes. Oh, God,
Very unhealthy. Well,
that is unbearable. I mean,
let's explain some of other things that you're seeing here. It's breezy today. It's windy.
right,
There's a mist blowing.
right,
So that's also has a potential of getting off the property, getting
Right.
into wood line, getting into people's homes. And if you also look at that field in general, it's domed. So where's that waste going?
right. It's going
it's gonna
down
run
towards
off.
the water.
Right.
I just can't believe that people in this community have to live with this on a daily basis. It's disgusting.
The odors, it just comes in, it smells so bad and that you can see it.
One lady tell me how she would get up in the morning, crack her door open just a little bit and see if it's stinking outside. If it's not stinking, then she go out and do what she had to do, but she's rushing to get everything done because she want to beat the odor.
It's like a horrific abuse of, we're big ag, so we're gonna come in and do whatever we want. And to hell with everyone whose lives we're ruining, whose homes we're making unbearable because it's got this disgusting smell coming through from this spray.
Well, they're polluting my air and others, everyone that's living near these facilities. They've polluted our water. They've disrupted our quality of life. They're affecting our health, our mental status, the embarrassment that comes along with this, the sense of helplessness and hopelessness. All of these things we have to deal with on a daily basis.
Dr. Steve Wing, who was a professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, he was working with a community that had asked him for help. One of the first things they did was to get the map of North Carolina, go to the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, and they pulled all the permits that had been given to the port industry to set up operations in North Carolina. And they used red pens and they pinned the map for every permit. And when they got done, what they discovered was that it was almost 10 million animals in North Carolina. The majority of those animals are in eastern North Carolina. And looking at the fact that where these animals were predominantly African American, Native American, and Latino communities. So we began talking about this whole question of environmental racism, where people are intentionally targeted because of their lack of political clout and economic power.
Tell me what that is right there.
It looks small from here because of this. But that's where that sprayer comes, and it's wide open. It shoots out a whole lot of stuff. And that lets just fly over.
And you cannot go outside when it's spraying.
I'm grateful to get on my skin. Because I have sensitive skin and I don't want to get sick or anything from that. Break out with sores or whatever.
I don't know where to go from here. Like as a scientist, and I have a degree in biology, so before I started going in circles in race cars, I did earn a degree in biology, and it frustrates me to no end that it's almost like the authority of science has been taken away. What can we do to help science get a little bit more respect from the public and from the politicians?
This is an era that I think is especially dangerous because science is certainly not the be all and end all. It's not the way, the truth, and the light in many respects in life. But there are certain scientific facts you had better listen to. Because if you don't, it's your own health that's at stake.
I used to have a mild touch of asthma, and now I have severe that I have to use a machine. I have to use a mask now. And I used to didn't do that. I only got sick when I moved to North Carolina. I have to use this, a little sprayer here. I shake it up, squirt some in my mouth. And that helps me to breathe a little bit better for a little while.
We had a group of volunteers and other river keepers, and we were sampling in this body of water, Stocky Head Creek, which is completely surrounded by cape. It's one of the most densely covered sub-basins in the Cape Fear Basin. And we spent a day sampling in this watershed. We took the results back to a state certified lab in Wilmington, and they ran the results. We got those results back, and they showed fecal counts in this stream that were thousands of times higher than what the safe limit was. We knew that they, were going to be high, but I had just no idea that the creek was essentially an open sewer.
When hurricanes come through here, the floodwaters wash over these lagoons, not all, but many of these lagoons. And they take it, suck the contents out, and the river turns the color of pink. Then there's hogs floating in the river like during Hurricane Floyd. Just had a hurricane last year, Hurricane Matt did the same thing. I didn't see hogs in the water this time because they didn't let them out of the barn.
One of the biggest fears with this industry is in the form of just illnesses. The swine flu from a number of years back, which was then changed to H1N1 because we didn't want to call swine flu. Started.
All right, I'm gonna stop the video there. I think it did a really good job of putting a picture on everything we talked about today. And I mean, every time I watch it, and I've seen this video hundreds of times, it continues to affect me. I think, Laura, you said there was a question?
Yes, so we have Savvy Sampson who has her hand raised. If you want to go ahead and unmute her, Gabrielle, we can go ahead and let her ask her question. Go ahead, Savvy.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I don't know if it was asked, so I apologize, or if you said, so I apologize if you did. But who's usually responsible or who takes in the burden of litigating these issues?
So it's usually the different nonprofits, and that's a great question. I don't think I answered it before. So one of the big ones, Earth Justice is a big nonprofit that does that work. The NRDC, Sierra Club, some of the smaller ones in North Carolina, some small community groups will bring in counsel. The Southern Environmental Law Center is one that does a lot of this work. And so for the most part, there are a number of law school clinics that do handle some of this. I know in the past, the University of Miami has an environmental justice clinic, and they've done EJ work down here. So it's usually the burden is on the nonprofits and other entities like that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, excellent job. Leigh, is there anything that you'd like to say in closing? We've answered all of our questions and we're about out of time. They're like perfectly timed.
All right. I realized sometimes I speak really fast and I thought, oh no, wow, I think I was worried that I wouldn't get everything in, and then I spoke so quickly. So I hope everyone caught everything. I realized I did not provide my email address. Laura, is that something that if people want, they can reach out for if they have any other questions? I also am happy to share. I have just a couple of what I thought really interesting articles that I can send to you if people want. And other than that, thank you all. And I hope to continue talking about these issues offline with anyone who wants to.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leigh. And thanks again to the Environmental Law Section for co-sponsoring this webinar series with us, the Animal Law Section. If you are not yet a member of either of those wonderful sections, I really encourage you to join, especially the Animal Law one. I wanted to give you all the course number for today. The course number is 8324. Again, the course number 8324. All right. For those of you who have my number, you can text me and ask me again, and I'll text it to you again, but it's 8324. Thank you all for joining us today, and we will see you at the next exciting animal law webinar series near you.
Thank you, everyone.